The Trump administration is radically reshaping America and the world around it. In the inaugural Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press, Dr. Emma Shortis examines Trump's grim vision for America and the future of the Australia-US alliance. Pre-order your copy of After America, Australia and the New World Order, or become a Foundation subscriber to Vantage Point at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hello, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. The Australian Labor Party won a major victory in Saturday's federal election, just days after Canada's centre-left party also pulled off a remarkable comeback.
Now let's go back to Australia because Anthony Albanese, the country's Prime Minister, has won re-election.
Similar to what we saw happen with Pierre Poilievre. The main Australian opposition candidate, Peter Dutton, has lost his riding.
It has media and commentators around the world pointing to a so-called Trump effect.
It may be thousands of miles away, but Trump and his policies did loom over that election.
The Australian election, the Conservatives did very badly, just like in Canada. They're saying it's the Trump effect again. Conservatives doing it. In Australia, there was an election this weekend. Well, I don't know. Albanese, I'm very friendly with me.
Certainly, Australians are rethinking their relationship with the United States. Published today, Australia Institute polling shows that more than half of Australians want a more independent foreign policy. Joining me today to talk about the results, whether the Trump effect is real, and what it might all mean for the future of the Australia-US relationship, is Director of International and Security Affairs, Dr. Emma Shortis. Hey, Emma.
Hey, Angus.
How are you going?
Good. Big weekend, hey?
Quite a weekend. Emma, outlets all over the world have been keen to talk about the Trump factor in the Australian election. But is it that simple?
I think it's really hard to say, Angus. Certainly American mainstream media is making a huge deal of the Australian election coming so quickly after it, as it does after the Canadian election. But of course, Americans will make things about themselves inevitably. And they are calling it a part of a global repudiation of Trumpism. And I think, of course, Trump played a role in the Australian election. He's playing a role in everything in the entire world. As we've discussed, he sucks all of the oxygen out of the room and had this kind of looming shadow, I think, over Australian politics, was setting the agenda for the election campaign early on around tariffs in particular. And of course, there was so much talk about how much like or unlike Peter Dutton is compared to Donald Trump, how similar his policies were to Trump's policies, if we can call them that, in terms of their effort to import things like the Department of Government Efficiency into some of those coalition policies. So, I certainly think that at least part of this result is a reaction to that kind of conservative politics and the right wing, but we also can't ignore the context of Australian politics specifically in terms of cost of living, for example, housing, issues that are kind of plaguing democracies across the world, but which have very specific Australian contexts. So that's kind of a long way of hedging, I guess, of saying, yes, it was partly about Trump. I think it was partly about Trump, but it was also very much about Australia. I think one thing it does demonstrate really clearly, though, is that Australia is not America. We're actually a very different kind of place.
And the Prime Minister was really at pains to point that out, right, in his victory speech. It was dripping with references to the US, even though he never actually specifically mentioned Trump or the United States or any other country.
Today, the Australian people have voted for Australian values. For fairness, aspiration and opportunity for all. For the strength to show courage in adversity and kindness to those in need. We do not need to beg or borrow or copy from anywhere else. We do not seek our inspiration overseas. We find it right here in our values and in our people.
What did you make of that speech?
I actually thought it was a really good speech. I don't know about you, Angus, but I thought that was done so well in that, he was clearly nodding to what is happening in the United States and Trumpism more broadly, but wasn't falling into the trap of addressing it directly because, of course, then that would have been all that anybody was talking about. But right from the very start, he was so pointed, I think, in that embrace of what he described as Australian values, to start with an acknowledgement of country, for example, that was so pointed and so emotional.
Penny Wong's as well, when the foreign minister introduced him, did exactly the same thing, right? Making that point.
Thank you for believing in the power of this great nation. The power in our 26 million people from more than 300 ancestries. And from the oldest continuing civilization on the planet. And I acknowledge the traditional owners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you have to take away from that a repudiation, not necessarily of Trumpism, but the kind of divisive politics that Peter Dutton was engaged in and for which Trump has become the reference point. Trump didn't invent that kind of division or the ability to, or the attempt to exploit that kind of division in politics. But Dutton was doing a similar thing. And because Trump has become the reference point, then of course, that's what people think about when you see that kind of very direct repudiation of that kind of politics. And Albanese, as you said, did that throughout his speech, especially I think at that point where he talked about Australian values and leaving no one behind and governing for all Australians. That was really pointed and I think really leaned into what he was doing in the last few days or week of the campaign, where he was using this phrase about kindness not being a weakness, which again, was directed at Dutton, but because Trump is our reference point for far-right politics, for conservative politics, of course it's in an indirect repudiation of Trumpism as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm definitely not an Australian political historian or anything like that, but what stood out to me was that it felt like he kind of hit his straps a bit in terms of a level of nationalism that you don't usually see from the left of politics, but making a point of being quite inclusive about it as well. I thought that was pretty interesting and not something that I'd certainly seen in the Australian political landscape before, on that bigger stage anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a real reluctance on the part of the left in Australia and in other nations as well, for good reason, to not engage in that kind of full-throated nationalism. But I think what we've spoken about before on the pod and what a lot of other people have spoken about before is the way that Trump offers us an opportunity to engage in a kind of progressive nationalism that is inclusive, but also talks about national values. And, the link that Albanese made explicitly between Australian values and healthcare, for example, and Medicare, I think was a much more direct engagement with that kind of nationalism that you're talking about. And our colleague, Greg Jericho, writes about this beautifully. He writes about progressive nationalism as a real opportunity, for the left in the face of Trumpism. Again, because Trump is so bad, he opens up this space for the left to be a bit braver than it might have been in the past. And I think that's potentially a really big shift in Australian politics where, we start to think a little bit about national security differently because we're so used to the coalition and the conservative side of politics dominating that space and perhaps being the more, I guess, trusted party when it comes to national security. There's this assumption in Australia that if we have a khaki election, if we have an election focused on defence or international relations, then the coalition will inevitably be stronger. That's not what's happened this time. So, it's potentially another example of how Trump is kind of shaking up the established assumptions of politics in Australian democracy, but in democracies across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned in your first answer voters making a connection between Dutton and Trump, for example. But we have some polling on this that's out today, Tuesday, as you're listening to this, if you're listening to it on the day it's released. What does it show us, I suppose, about about what Australians think about the connections between the leaders and the Trump administration.
The polling is really interesting. So we polled 1,500 Australians just before the election, and the results we got, I think, really back up this assumption that we're making about Trump having some kind of influence on the election, and particularly about how people thought about Peter Dutton as potential Prime Minister. So we asked respondents, when they were thinking about Donald Trump, how similar or different they thought each party leader was to Trump. And when they were asked about Anthony Albanese, only about 10% of respondents thought that he was similar or very similar to Donald Trump, whereas 75% of people thought he was very different or different. So huge kind of gap there.
And that's not really surprising given, he's from the centre left of politics.
Exactly. And he's kind of constitutionally very different as well, and made a real effort, of course, during the campaign to distance himself from Trumpism. Whereas Dutton, on the other hand, we got results that kind of reinforce this idea that people were making a direct connection between Dutton and Trumpism, because 44% of respondents thought that Dutton was similar or very similar to Donald Trump, compared to that 10% with just Albanese. And I think we can conclude from that people were making an association. And given that Dutton lost so badly, given that the coalition has been effectively decimated at the federal level, I think we can draw some conclusions out of that. It's not necessarily a direct repudiation of Trumpism, because the election wasn't all about Donald Trump, but it certainly played a role.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Emma. And something that stood out to me with the numbers there are that, yes, 44% overall think Dutton is similar to Trump, similar or very, very similar, but 40% of people think he's different to Trump. Like, we talked with Australia Institute Executive Director Richard Dennis a few weeks ago about the challenge for the conservative side of politics in Australia and other countries in managing this second Trump administration in particular.
Part of them wants to just be on Trump's side. Part of them wants to put Australia first and be Australian strong men and women. And part of them want to stick with free trade, because their whole political career they've been lying about how important free trade and freedom was. So they're torn three ways. Do they suck up and say Trump's right and we should get with the program? Do they say, no, we need to kind of copy Trump but put Australia first, not America? Or do we stick with the old world order and just keep saying free trade a lot? Well, they're all just spiralling around the toilet bowl at the moment, and no one knows what's going to go down first.
And we've seen through Dutton's tactics throughout the campaign that he'd sort of dip into some Trumpy stuff, Doge, the Australian Doge or whatever they called it, and some identity politics stuff, going on about woke, whatever. But then he'd distance himself from it. That would seem to suggest to me that voters are a bit confused about it as well, and that this ideological kind of divide within the coalition is playing out in real time, and they haven't resolved that at all.
Absolutely. I think they haven't resolved it. And that was perhaps one of the failings of the coalition's campaign, is that they tried to pick and choose the bits of Trumpism that they like and import it while leaving some of it behind, So Dutton most obviously distanced himself pretty significantly from Donald Trump on Ukraine. Peter Credlin, the, power broker, maybe we could call her, coalition power broker, did the same thing, writing in The Australian, trying to walk this line where they were devastated by what Trump did and is doing in Ukraine, but also, quite explicitly say, but they like some of the stuff that he is doing at home. And I think voters perhaps implicitly saw the internal kind of ideological contradictions of that and responded accordingly. But this is something that, it's affecting the right across the world, as well as, Trump's America First agenda hurts the interests of America's traditional allies, and much of the right still isn't sure how to respond. And I think you can see that in the coalition now, where they're already kind of having an internal fight about, whether they got too close to Trumpism or not close enough. Was Dutton too woke, or did he kind of not go hard enough? And, of course, there are interests at play there, and this is about kind of internal power struggles as well. But those kinds of ideological contradictions, and I think the assumption on the part of at least some people in the coalition that you can directly import Trumpism into a political system that is radically different. I mean, we're seeing the results of that, aren't we, this week? And a party that is in turmoil. And I think a global right that was unprepared for the effect that Trumpism would have on democratic politics. I think there was this assumption that the rise of Trump or the re-rise of Trump would be good for the far right across the world, that it was part of a resurgence of the global far right, particularly in Europe, but in Canada as well. Like, it looked like there would be a conservative victory, but it hasn't played out that way. And I think much of the right, and the far right in particular, is still not sure how to respond, and is realizing that you can't pick and choose the bits of American fascism that you like and leave the rest behind. That's not how it works.
So you just mentioned Canada. Australia, obviously not the only US ally, having an election last week, and the centre-left Liberal Party in Canada won a massive victory against all odds. A month, 2 months out, it looked like they were headed for absolute decimation, and have come back and won the election. Media across the world is making a really big deal of this, arguing that it's part of this global repudiation of Trumpism. And some journalists and commentators even going as far as sort of suggesting that the Trump administration is single-handedly revitalizing the global left. Do you think that's what's going on here?
I mean, I think it's probably too early to say. I think absolutely we can say that part of this is wishful thinking amongst the American left that are hoping that Trump will somehow revitalize the Democratic Party, which so far it has absolutely not done. It's revitalized parts of the Democratic base, but certainly not the established powerful center of the Democratic Party. So some of it, I think, is wishful thinking. I think, again, we can argue that these results are part of a response to Trumpism and what Trump is doing. Certainly in Canada, clearly the victory of the Liberals was about, partly at least, what Trump is doing. The campaign was going to be a referendum on Trudeau, and it very quickly shifted to almost a referendum on Canada's relationship with the United States because of what Trump is doing. He's posing a direct threat to Canada, and Canadians have responded in kind.
Yeah, they're in an all-out trade war, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. One that Trump has threatened to escalate to an actual war. So this is very serious for Canadians in a way that it isn't necessarily for Australia because of geographic distance, because Trump doesn't pay as much attention to us. When he does, it's when some journalist asks him if he's going to accept a call from the Prime Minister and he says no. Like, he's, more focused on this plan that Senator Lindsey Graham has for him to be the next Pope. He's not thinking about Australia, right? And so the context is really different. And also fellow podcaster David Smith, who's at the University of Sydney, has a really good article in The Conversation today, Monday, Australian time, comparing the Canadian and Australian elections and arguing, I think, really effectively that part of what's happened, there are absolutely similarities, but the Canadian political system is also really different. They don't have preferential voting, and so people have voted kind of strategically against Trumpism, but Canada hasn't seen the same kind of decimation of the Conservatives that we've seen in Australia. So context there, I think, is really important. Like, I don't think we should make sweeping assumptions about the revitalization of the global left. But absolutely, Trump is creating a response, as we've said so many times. He's so bad. What he is doing is so awful that, of course, democracies are responding, and some of them are doing it in unexpected ways.
Yeah. So I'm interested to hear about what you think this means for Australia's relationship with the United States going forward. In addition to his election night victory speech, Anthony Albanese has used some pretty strong language about Trump's tariffs, and we've talked about that on the show before. Do you expect that this Australian Parliament, that this Australian government might be more assertive with the Trump administration?
I think that's certainly possible. I think they will draw a lot of confidence they'll draw a lot of confidence from this election result and polling which consistently shows deepening concern amongst the electorate about the Trump administration and what it is doing. So YouGov, for example, did a poll before the election that is very much in line with the polling results we've gotten here at the Australia Institute. But this poll asked about who Australians trusted more to deal with the Trump administration. And 55% of voters polled said that they thought Albanese was best placed to handle the relationship in Australia's interest, compared to just 45% with Peter Dutton, which again, is a pretty significant turnaround when it comes to how we think about national security. But I think the Labor government will draw some confidence from that. They will draw confidence from, using that strong language around the tariffs and around Australian values, in particular around kindness. That may give them space, I think, to be I'm not sure if assertive is the right word, but to be perhaps stronger in standing up for Australian interests. I think we have to be a little bit careful because, this election wasn't a referendum on the alliance or a referendum on foreign policy. So I don't think we're going to see or can expect that the government will feel it has a mandate for a huge shift in how it does foreign policy. But I think what it does do, what having such a significant majority does do, is buy the government space to approach the alliance in a considered way without the kind of hysteria around the Trump administration and who's best placed to handle Trump. What do we have to give him, in order that he'll like us? The government can push back a little bit on that. And I would hope as well that some of the mainstream media, it's probably a naive hope, but, won't be quite so hysterical about Trumpism and, the need to cozy up to Trump in order to protect Australian interests. I think that conversation at least is changing, and there is more space for that kind of progressive nationalism that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. And what does our polling show us about how Australians are thinking about the, defence security relationship, the alliance? Does the election result suggest that there's some sort of deeper change going on or something different?
I think the result, alongside some of the more specific polling that we're seeing around the alliance, is suggesting that there is this bigger shift underway. We spoke about this when we got those first polling results in which Australians put Donald Trump on a par with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Our results that we've released today are consistent with that, and in fact are seeing an increase in the kind of concern that we were talking about around the alliance. So we asked Australians again in this poll if they think Australia's interests are served better by a closer alliance with the United States or a more independent foreign policy. 26% of respondents chose a closer alliance with the United States, compared to 54% who chose a more independent foreign policy. And that's a 10% shift on polling we did only a couple of months ago. So things are changing really, really quickly.
And what do you put that change down to?
I think it's a direct response to Trump and what he is doing. I think it's reflective of an erosion of trust in the United States under the Trump administration. So when we first asked Australians this question, we asked them before that meeting with Zelensky in the White House. We asked them before Trump's Liberation Day tariffs were imposed on Australia and the world. And so I think we're seeing a direct response to that, and Trump's, attacks on the established world order, his domestic policies as well. All of that is reflected in these polling results, and results as well that say, Australians are really concerned about what is happening in the United States as well. So when we asked them if they thought Trump being elected was a good or bad thing for the United States, 61% said it was bad. It was bad or very bad for the United States that Trump had been elected. 65% said it was also bad for the world. So, I think you can see that increasing concern about what Trump is doing, what it means for the world, and what comes next.
The point you make about trust is really interesting. And for most people, most of the time, they're probably not thinking about the high level defense security relationship, right? They're not talking.
Yeah, not weirdos like us.
Yeah, correct. And all power to them. But it appears as though we're seeing this reflected in other, maybe slightly more mundane choices that people are making. I've been getting ads on podcasts and on YouTube and stuff for US tourism, which at the time seemed pretty unusual. People just go to the US. I feel like they didn't usually need to advertise. Maybe it's just my algorithm, maybe because I talk about America a lot now. The number of ads has seemed to increase for me anyway. But at the same time, people are pulling back from the US. At least that's what some of the latest data seems to suggest, right?
Yeah, it does. And that is so interesting because, I mean, I think I talk about the US more than you do, and those ads are not showing up in my algorithm.
Do we think it might have something to do with me being a white man?
Possibly. Maybe the algorithms also picked up my anti-Trump sentiment that means I wouldn't get past border security anymore.
Yeah.
But I think that is really interesting, and maybe that increase in advertising is a response to exactly what is happening. So there was this really interesting article, again in The Conversation recently, by a couple of researchers on tourism numbers to the United States and how they are tanking, and particularly tanking for Australians. So it was Anita Manfreda and Madeline Sherry, I think, in The Conversation, who wrote that Australian visitor numbers to the United States fell by 7% in March, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's the sharpest fall, they've said, since the COVID pandemic, when we couldn't travel to the United States. And that, I think that says so much, exactly as you were saying, about the eroding, like catastrophically eroding trust on the part of Australians when it comes to the United States. And it's another, I think, really important example, like, I know I go on and on and on about this, but an example of how there aren't clean lines between domestic politics and foreign policy. You know, Australians recognise that what Trump is doing in the domestic United States has very real implications for them, and they're so worried about it that they're reconsidering travelling to the United States. And I think it's really important to say, with very good reason, like, this is not people being hysterical. This is people responding rationally to very real risk.
And if you're listening and you're interested in hearing more about this, we spoke to Dr. Prudence Flowers about her experience working around gender issues and her colleagues' experience. I recommend you go check that episode out. It was last week's.
I should just add, Angus, that it isn't necessarily that straightforward a shift. I feel like I've been saying that a lot today, that maybe I'm hedging a bit. But we also did get some really interesting results when we asked our respondents about the AUKUS security agreement, so the nuclear-powered submarines deal that, you know, of course, we talk about a lot and gets a lot of attention when it comes to talking about Australia's relationship with the United States. We asked respondents whether they think the AUKUS security agreement makes Australia more safe, less safe, or if they don't know or are not sure. And 48.5% of respondents said that they thought AUKUS made Australia more safe, compared to 22% who thought it made Australia less safe. 30% of respondents were unsure, which is quite a high number as well, and I think like some confusion around AUKUS and what it is and what it's meant to do. But the fact that the number of Australians who think that AUKUS makes us safer is quite high, I think, is significant. And that's a number that actually hasn't shifted significantly over the last couple of years. It's the first time we've asked this question, but the Lowy Institute has asked this question a few times. And when they asked it in 2023, they got a broadly similar result where 49% of Australians thought that AUKUS made us safer. So there is still, I think, that abiding trust in the alliance more broadly above Trump and Trumpism. It's shifting in unexpected ways, and I think there's a lot to play out there. But I guess I'm still on the fence about whether this is a fundamental shift or if it is an immediate response to Trumpism that may, you know, level out or may continue to change in response to what he is doing. I think it's, you know, I think things feel pretty volatile at the moment, and these results possibly reflect that.
And the picture around our defence and security relationship gets more complex still when you look at another of our polling questions. We asked people whether they'd support or oppose a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS, something the UK government is undertaking right now. What did we find?
Yeah, so these results are really strong, I guess, in terms of this straightforward question about getting some democratic oversight and accountability when it comes to AUKUS. 57% of respondents said they support or strongly support a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS, compared to just 17% who would oppose or strongly oppose. So that's a pretty stark gap. You know, I think that's pretty significant support for oversight of the AUKUS deal, and is reflective of concerns, big concerns that we heard during the campaign about what AUKUS is, and particularly, you know, how much it's going to cost. So again, I think this reflects some potentially pretty interesting changes in how Australians feel about not just the alliance with the United States, but security more broadly. You know, Trump is raising so many questions for Australia and the world about what makes us safer, and Australians quite clearly wanting some more democratic oversight of the AUKUS security agreement, again, troubles some of the assumptions we have about Australian politics, like one of which is that as a default, we always want to spend more on defence. You know, there's always this argument that we have to spend more in order to make us safer. And sometimes the polling bears this out, but not in straightforward ways. But I think this result suggests that at least there is a desire for more accountability around defence spending. And when we put it alongside how Australians are feeling about the alliance and about Donald Trump in particular, and alongside how catastrophically bad the AUKUS deal actually is, I think the potential for there to be significant pushback on the deal and on the broadly anti-democratic nature of defence and defence spending is certainly a possibility.
Emma, I think that's all we've got time for. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Angus.
And if you want to read the full polling results, they're out on our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or we'll leave a link in the show notes. Don't forget, you can pre-order your copy of our inaugural Vantage Point essay. The first edition, After America, Australia and the New World Order, is out this week and is written by Dr. Emma Shortis. You can purchase the first edition or become a Foundation subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. Before you go as well, we'd love to get your thoughts on the show today. You can send us feedback as well as episode and guest ideas to our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday the 5th of May, and no doubt a bunch of stuff will have changed since then. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation, and our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.